Author Night with author Michael Balter. I'm April Younglove. I'm an adult services librarian here at Lake Oswego Public Library, and we're glad that you can join us. Whether you're joining us in person or via streaming, we're glad you're here. Before we begin our program, we're going to have a couple messages for you, and then afterwards as well, I want to remind people that we have a brief survey after the program that really helps us with planning, so if you would please fill it out. And also we put it conveniently right next to the cookies, so if you're taking a cookie, maybe thinking about filling out a survey, that would help us a lot. And then also, if you're having any trouble hearing or you're hard of hearing in any way, we do have a new assistive listening system, and the librarian at the table back there can help you set that up if you're interested. And without further ado, here is a message from our Friends organization.
Good evening, everyone, and those of you at home. My name is Janet Buck, and I am on the board of the Friends of the Lake Oswego Public Library. I would like to welcome you tonight on behalf of the Friends to let you know also that it is the Friends who underwrite events such as this, our music events, earlier in the month, every month, and many other events as well. And we're just coming upon April, which is the month when there are many, many events. I counted at least 20 events in Lake Oswego celebrating our Lake Oswego Reads, of which the Friends of the Library is a primary supporter. So besides welcoming you, I'm so glad that you're here to hear our author tonight. I would really encourage you to become a friend of the library if you're not already. It's only $25 a year, $40 for a family. And I feel that the Friends support not just the library, but in the end, we really support our community and bring community people together like tonight and for all the events that you'll see during Lake Oswego Reads. So welcome. So glad that you're here tonight, and I'll be back there by my big sign afterwards if you'd like to join. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And before we get started, now I get the fun part, and that is telling you a little bit about this author, Michael Balter. He wrote the book Chasing Money. It won the 2023 Best Indie Book Award for crime thrillers, and it has a Lake Oswego connection. It's a gritty, heart-pounding thriller. There are two partners in a struggling Lake Oswego startup, relatable, and then they go against an angry Russian killer seeking $10 million and a missing painting. I think that's a great setup for a story. It's a very exciting read. Michael is an accomplished storyteller. His book was inspired by his own experiences as an entrepreneur, and he extensively researched the real masterpiece at the heart of his story. The real masterpiece was looted by Nazis in World War II and has never been found, so maybe you'll be the one to find it. Michael.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. She said it all. We're done. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and to those of you at home listening. So what we're going to do today is it's going to be about a half an hour or so talk, and we're going to talk about the book. I'm going to specifically talk about one of the key elements of the book, which is the painting, and we'll get into that here in a little bit. I'm also going to read a little bit because I was told that at library talks, the author should read something. So I'm going to read, but don't worry, I'm only going to read about a page and a half, maybe two, so you won't get bored. There are people in the audience here who know me quite well, and so they've already heard most of my stories. And so for those of you who get bored, do what my wife does, nap. Just no problem. So, all right, so let's get started. A little bit about myself. And there's a reason I'm going to tell you all this, because it all relates back. So I was born in Berlin, came to the country when I was 15, went into the military, became an air traffic controller, went to Vietnam, came out of Vietnam, got an aeronautical engineering degree as an undergraduate, then went on to get a master's in business, and then went to work for what was then still a very small company called Intel. Worked for Intel for 20 years, and I got the entrepreneurial bug, and left and basically was an entrepreneur for the next 20 plus years. And the book is based on most of my experiences as an entrepreneur. So on that note, I'm getting a weird message here, so I just want to see. Let cross this one off your list. No. Restart now. No. Should I hit restart now? I'm not sure what's happening. Whoops. Sorry.
No. It's
Sorry.
being rude.
Oh, it's being rude? Rude. All right, so, yes, so about the book, I'm sorry, I lost my spot. Being an entrepreneur, and the story is based on that, one of give you a little background on the book itself, is that, again, what was said earlier, it's about basically two entrepreneurs who are struggling to keep their company alive, and they're out chasing money. They're trying to raise capital for their company, and they take on a third partner. And that third partner, they should have probably vetted a little bit better, because it didn't quite work out. They ended up going to a pitch meeting, an investor pitch meeting. And while they're at the investor pitch meeting, hoping to raise capital from an investor, they actually get shanghaied by a Russian mobster who demands $10 million from them and the return of a mysterious painting, or he will kill them and their families, and then to make his point, he shoots the third partner, and right in front of them. That's the first 9 pages of the book. And he gives them 4 days to find the money and the painting, and the rest of the book, after those 9 pages, unpacks those next 4 days. Okay? So I wrote the book. It came out. Now I get to brag a little bit, and it did quite well. I'm kind of proud of this, but it's my very first book, and it won the Best Independent Book Award, as was said earlier, and which is a national award for crime thriller for 2023. It also won the Feathered Quill Award, which is also a national award, and the category that it won in was for mystery, suspense, and thriller. Now, I'm really proud of that, because if you think about those 3, those are giant genres, right? I mean, there are a lot of books in those genres. So you know that they were looking at an awful lot of books to cover those 3 genres, and I won. So I kind of like that. So the other thing is I also won the silver for Best Debut Author for the year for 2024. So I tried to find out who got first place so I could look them up and arrange for an accident. But I found out that it's not like a beauty contest where if the winner suddenly has an accident, the runner-up gets elevated. It doesn't happen that way, so I just decided to let it go. So, all right, so one of the most frequent questions that gets asked of me is, how did you come up with this idea? How did you think of writing this book, right? I've never written a book. And it actually resulted from a joke. The whole thing came about as a joke. So my best friend and business partner, Roy Rose, he and I have been business partners for 20 plus years, being entrepreneurs. And we were in New York about, I want to say 8, 9 years ago. And we were looking to raise capital for a startup that actually gets mentioned in the book. And we were, it was a grueling day. And the thing that most people don't realize is that raising capital is really a grueling, stressful job. It's not like what you see in Hollywood. You know, they've kind of fabulized it. You know, it's kind of like, you know, some struggling, hard-working entrepreneur, you know, runs into a billionaire who loves the cut of his jib and decides to write him a $10 million check. That's not how it works. And so it's just a grueling grind trying to raise capital. And so we had spent all day doing this, and we were pretty frustrated, and I was pretty stressed out. And we were walking back to our hotel, and it was dark. And Roy said, you know, let's pick up the pace because I'm feeling a little comfortable walking the streets of New York at night. Let's get to the hotel. And I said, you know what, Roy? Right now, I am so stressed out that if somebody decides to rob us and stick a gun in my face, I would probably ask him to invest in the company before he pulled the trigger. Okay. And Roy laughed, right? And so we walk back to the hotel. We get to the hotel. We stop at the lobby bar. We have a couple of scotches. And Roy says, you know, that would actually make a pretty interesting story. And so we spent about an hour and a half getting completely wasted and coming up with all different kinds of ideas. And we used to do this all the time. And it was a way to relieve stress. And we'd come up with these kind of fanciful ideas of how, you know, things might work if this happened or that happened or whatever. So, but I couldn't let it go. And so for the next, like, I think 8 years, okay, every time I had the opportunity to, you know, kind of think about this. So like if I was on a long drive and I was on, or a walk or something, I would start playing around with this idea. And over a course of 8 years, I started kind of building an entire story, an entire plot in my head, okay? And it was just, it's like a little daydream fantasy that you have, right? And you just kind of play with it when you have the time to do that. So that's how the entire kind of book was originally created in my head. So then what happened was that I retired and needed something to do, and then decided that I was going to see if I can take this thing that I've been floating around with for the last 8 years in my head and get it down on paper. And it didn't work because I'd never written a book before, and I wasn't very good at it. And when I would write, and then I would go back the next day, and I would read what I wrote the day before. I'd throw up a little bit in my mouth, and then I would, hi guys, come on back. And it just wasn't working. I mean, it really wasn't working. And so I'm taking a walk one day with my wife, and she says, so, hon, how's that book thing coming along? And I said, it's not. And she said, well, why? And I told her about all the different things and all the struggles that I was having. And she said, you know, Michael, you got to stop worrying about writing the book. Start telling the story. And she said, Michael, she said, my entire life with you, you tell wonderful stories. You tell stories all the time. You can't go to the grocery store without coming back with a frigging story. So just tell the story. Like pretend that you met an old friend at a bar and you just go up to him and say, oh my God, you're not going to believe what happened to me. The very next day, I went and I started writing exactly the way she told me to. And before I knew it, I had pages and pages and pages. So it actually worked. It was kind of like I just needed to find that story voice. And also at the very same time, there was a song on the radio. And I was driving home from a coffee shop or something, and on comes this country and western song. I don't even remember the name of the song, actually, to be honest with you. But there's a line in the song that says, chase after the dream, don't chase after the money. And I'm driving, you know, and I'm hearing that and going, yeah, right. Yeah, that'll never happen. And I suddenly said, oh my God. That's the beginning of my book. I just found the beginning of my book. So, one of the readings, For those of you who came late, don't worry, I'm not going to bore you. I'm only going to read like a page. So, because I just said that's the beginning of my book, I will now read to you the beginning of the book. All right, chapter 1, Monday evening, the pitch meeting. There's a line in a country song that goes, chase after the dream, don't chase after the money. Well, I'm here to tell you that's wrong. Fuck the dream, chase the money. Always chase the money. It's what Bo Bishop and I have been doing in one form or another for several years now. Raising capital, building runways, stocking angels, bootstrapping are all the same thing. Convincing someone kind, generous, greedy, or stupid to fund your ambition to become rich. The trick here is not to find someone with money, but rather to find someone with throwaway money, or someone who wants to make throwaway money, also called an angel investor. Raising capital is a trial for every entrepreneur. There are outliers who manage to bag investor money as if it were a pizza delivery because they have the genius, the credentials, or the connections to underwrite their venture. For most of us, however, it's an endless, soul-destroying process of begging the privileged to keep the doors open while the world works hard to keep them shut. That's how Bo and I came to be in a shabby little wood cabin about 20 miles west of Mount Hood, strapped to cheap chrome kitchen chairs, our hands taped behind our back and our ankles taped to the chair legs. We were terrified and tractable. Nico, our silent partner and the reason for everything that happened, was there as well. One of the rare times he elected to join us on a potential investor pitch. His hands and feet were taped like Bo's and mine. The chairs sat side by side on top of a blue painter's tarp rolled out over the cabin's wood floor. It was a fishing cabin, purposely not fancy, with a slight smell of wet tent. A couple of antler mounts hung on paneled walls between a mounted shotgun and two old fishing rods crossed like swords. A faded U.S. flag was nailed to the stone fireplace. Much of the Sears catalog furniture had been moved about to make room for the tarp and the chairs. A bald, beefy guy with more fat than muscle stood over us, his fleshy, tattooed fingers fiddled with a large roll of black Gorilla Tape he'd used to strap us down. It must have been a tough job tying our hands and feet because he was breathing heavily through his mouth, and his face, a boxer's face with a nose that had seen more than its share of punishment, was shiny with sweat. Another big guy with more muscles than fat, dark oily hair, squinty eyes, and a stern face stood a couple of feet back, waving a Beretta 9mm like a baton. Not that I knew it was a Beretta 9mm, that came later. So that's how I opened the book. So, now, a little bit about the characters. So as I was coming up with this plot in my head for 8 years, obviously I didn't do it with strangers. You know, your mind doesn't work that way. Your brain doesn't work that way. You don't sit around and think about this like this complicated fantasy thing that's going on in your head by using people you don't know. So you use people you do know. And that's why most of the characters are, certainly many of the characters in the book, are based on people that I either know, did know, met, had contact with, read about, what have you. So they're all familiar to me, and the most familiar, obviously, are the two main characters, Marty and Bo. And I based those, and I drew very heavily on those two characters, obviously, and they are, in fact, my best friend Roy and me. And to one more, this is a very short thing, this is only about like 4 or 5 paragraphs, but it really defines the difference between my best friend Roy and me, Marty and Bo. Bo drove. Bo always drove. In his former life, before he lost everything, his hobby was auto racing. I know nothing about racing, hunting, rodeos, football, or the many other activities that define Bo. We're as different as two people can be. Bo grew up a cowboy on a ranch in eastern Oregon, while I grew up a German immigrant in the decaying suburbs of Detroit. He's athletic. I'm not. He's interesting. I'm not. He's confident. I'm pretty sure I'm not. I could continue on this track, but in the end, the best way to illustrate how different we are is to tell you this. When Bo was rich, he raced Formula GTP cars. His career ended one day when he touched wheels with another car, careened across the track, slammed into the inside barrier, and went airborne, spun 3 times laterally at an estimated force of 12 Gs, sheared off his wheels, and helicoptered another 3 times through the infield grass. A crash so magnificent, it made the ESPN highlight reel for the entire season. When I was rich, I collected fountain pens. Truer words were never spoken. I swear, I really did at one point in my life collect fountain pens, and Roy at one point in his life actually raced cars. So those are the 2 main characters. So the other main character, or not main character, but one of the other characters that I wanted to just mention out of respect is, and I didn't draw from this character. I mean, this is 100% accurate to this character, okay? Not a little fictionalized version. This is the character, okay? And that, of course, is Boomer. The greatest dog that ever lived, and everything that I wrote in the book about Boomer is true. Everything. In fact, funny story, my sister-in-law is a judge in northern Michigan. And she read the book, and then she came up to me and she said, Michael, she said, look, she said, I was able to deal with the killing and the mayhem and the murders, but when Boomer went missing, I freaked out. Good point. I didn't kill the dog. All right, so now what I want to talk about is the painting at the heart of the book. So the reason, by the way, that I chose this is because I could talk about a lot of different things about the book, but I decided to talk about the painting because when the book actually first was sent to the publisher, okay, it was actually about 8,000 to 9,000 words longer than it was when it got published. And so the first manuscript that I sent to the publisher was approximately 89,000 words. What got published was approximately, I think, 79 and change thousand words, okay? So the reason for that is because I loved this painting story. It had just all this really cool stuff, and I had done a ton of research, and I wanted, and I put it all in. And I had all the stuff about what happened to it in World War II, and what happened to it when it was shuffled around between the Nazis, and when all that stuff. And my editor came back, and there were like red lines everywhere, right? And it was like, no, drop this. No, you got to cut this. You got to trim this. You're going on too long. And finally, she said, are you writing an art history book or are you writing a thriller? And but as I was cutting, and it's really painful, okay? If you spend, years writing something, and then you have to eliminate it, it's really tough to do. And so as I was doing it, I kept thinking to myself, okay, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to save all this information and I'm going to use it for the library talks. I was thinking ahead, okay? So that's why we're going to talk now about the painting. So one of the very first companies that Roy and I had as entrepreneurs was an art company. And I'd spent much of my career, obviously, at Intel as a technologist, so I knew nothing about art. And so I spent a lot of time reading art magazines, just so that I could understand, the art world. And one day I read this really interesting article that just fascinated me, and it was an article about this most valuable lost painting in the world. And that it has a reward on it for $100 million. $100 million as a reward. And what fascinated me was that there was a number. And one of the things that they pointed out in the article is that the reason it has a number associated with it, a value associated with it, is because historians and art experts believe that it still exists, that it is in fact still around. Because if it had been destroyed, or if it somehow, ended up at the bottom of the ocean somewhere, it wouldn't have a value associated with it. It would have a historical reference, right? But it wouldn't have a value because it doesn't exist anymore. And so I thought that was a really fascinating thing because no one had seen this painting in many, many years. And so the painting itself is a portrait of a young man by Raphael. Okay, so if you're not familiar with Raphael Sanzio, he was a contemporary of Da Vinci and Michelangelo. In fact, he worked at the Vatican at the very same time that Michelangelo was painting the Sistine Chapel. In fact, Michelangelo was so jealous of Raphael that every night he locked the Sistine Chapel so that he could not sneak in and see what his work was. Okay, so they were contemporaries. And the thing that I also found interesting is that the painting itself, and I'll talk more about what happened to it, is that what you're looking at is actually a replica of what people think it looked like. It went missing because the Nazis stole it in 1939. We'll talk about that in a minute. But when it went missing, prior to 1939, no one had ever taken a color photograph of it. So there were plenty of black and white photographs, but no one had ever taken a color photograph of it. And so what happened is that after the war, as historians were trying to kind of figure out, that what they did is they had to go to people who had been to the museum where it was prior to being stolen by the Nazis, and they would literally question them and say, well, tell me what color was this and what color was that. So this is actually a replica of what they think it looked like from eyewitnesses that are now long dead. Okay? So I thought that was always a fascinating thing about this particular painting. So the way its provenance is a little complicated, and I won't bore you with all of it, but the bottom line is that let me back up for a moment, I lost my place. So it was stolen out of the, I always mispronounce this, the Czartoryski Museum in Poland in 1939 by the Nazis. And prior to that, it had a very convoluted provenance because after Raphael died, Raphael died at a very early age. He died at 27. So imagine, he's literally contemporary to Michelangelo and Da Vinci, yet he dies at 27. He's already done all the stuff in the Vatican, all the stuff that he's famous for, et cetera, and he dies at 27. So they believe, they don't know for sure, but they believe that one of his students actually kind of made off with the painting, okay, kept it in his family for many, many, many years. And so finally it came to the market about 250 years later in the middle of the 1700s. And a guy by the name of Adam, again, Czartoryski, who is the son of Isabella Czartoryski, who was a noble of Poland, and who started the very first museum for Poland. And she was also a very enlightened woman. She was married, but she had so many affairs and so many different lovers, true, this is what I read, that in fact every single one of her 3 children had a disputed parentage. So there were 3 gentlemen who basically claimed fatherhood, and none of them was her husband, right? So Adam, one of her sons, decides to buy the Raphael, and he also buys at the same time the Da Vinci, which is Lady with the Ermine and the Landscape and the Samaritan by Rembrandt, and he buys all 3 of them, and then he gifts them to his mom, okay, so that she can open up this museum that she's now started, okay. Those 3 paintings became known throughout Europe as the Great Three. So, but then World War II comes along, right? They managed to shuffle them around and kind of hide them during World War I, and there's this very long and very convoluted history with them, which again, I don't want to bore you with. But World War II was a major event. And so what the Tsiolkovsky family did was they boxed up the Great Three, and they shipped them to another one of their castles, okay, and I believe you pronounce that as Sinewa, and they put it in a room in the attic. I actually watched videos on this. They put them in the room in the attic, and then they basically walled off the room, and they figured they were going to be safe there, right? And so then 1939 comes along, the war comes along, the Nazis invade Poland, they basically take over the Sinewa Castle, and within about 24, 48 hours they find the Great Three. And they know what they are because they're world famous throughout Europe, and they ship them immediately to Berlin for Hitler, okay? So Hitler wants them in his own museum. That was his intent. His number one guy, the next guy up to Hitler, a guy by the name of Hermann Goering, who was basically in charge of the Nazi apparatus, he was as big a hoarder as Hitler was. And he decided to commandeer the Great Three for himself. And he shipped them to his hunting lodge, which was in a forest in just north of Berlin, and it was huge. He already had like hundreds of paintings there that he'd basically looted from all the different countries and museums around, like out of France, etc. And he basically put them there, and when Hitler found out about it, he got kind of PO'd, and what he did was he recommandeered them and then gave them for holding to his personal lawyer, a guy by the name of Hans Frank. And Hans Frank was not just the personal lawyer for Adolf Hitler, he was also the number one lawyer for the Nazi Party. And when they overran Poland, and they took over control of Poland, they put him in charge as the governor of the occupied Poland. So Hans Frank was a real dirtbag. This guy was real scum. By the way, and that says a lot given the other comparison. You know what I'm saying here? Okay? So, and I say this because he ran not just Poland, but he also ran all of the concentration camps that were in Poland. So he was in charge of, okay, Auschwitz, Birkenau, Treblinka, all right? So he was a really bad guy, okay? So and he kept the paintings and hung them in his office. And so now we're going through, and we're now at the end of the war. And as we're getting close to the end of the war, the Russians are now on the march to Berlin, right? So the Russians are coming from the east, the Allies are coming from the west, right? And to get to Berlin, the Russians have to go through Poland. So he's out of there. So he had his own little entourage, right? He had a fleet of trucks, and he had drivers, and he had like a cadre of about 40 or 50 soldiers who were there to protect him, you know, and all that kind of stuff. And so he loaded all this stuff up, all the loot and the Great Three, and all the other stuff that he stole from, you know, the museums and all the Jews that they had imprisoned, and he was able to get all that possessions. So he loaded all this stuff up, and he decides to basically retreat, okay, from Warsaw to Bavaria, which is where his house is, because that's where his wife and children live, okay. Not sure why he had a wife and children, because he's such a scumbag, but he did. So So he loads up everything and he heads out, but he doesn't go there immediately, right? Because they have to stop every once in a while because they have to refuel. They have to feed the soldiers. They have to do all that stuff. And it's not the best time of year. So they stop, interestingly enough, at Baron von Richthofen's castle. Now, those of you who don't know this, this is very important. This is probably the most important part of this entire talk. Those of you who do not know, but Baron von Richthofen is, yes, the Red Baron, and most importantly, Snoopy's #1 enemy. Remember that. So they hang out for a week or so at this castle. It's the last time that anyone saw the painting. Okay? So, but there was this really interesting story as I was researching all this. There was this very interesting story that I just kind of latched onto, and I'll get to that later. Well, why it's important is that I read about how they were ready to leave because the Russians were coming. They were about maybe a day away from overtaking the Red Baron's castle, and they basically reloaded the trucks and gasolined everything up, and they were all ready to go. And all of a sudden, Hans Frank disappears. Poof, gone for about 48 hours. And they're all freaking out because they're going, the Russians are like just around the corner. We got to get the hell out of here, but our commander is gone. Well, it turns out that what he had done is he had decided to take his car by himself, without his driver even, and without anyone else. And he decided to go to another village that was about like 15-minute drive away to visit a guy by the name of Gerhard Hauptmann. So Gerhard Hauptmann, okay, was a very important person in the overall European kind of literary hierarchy, because it turns out that he won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1912, and Hans Frank, who thought of himself as kind of a man of letters, okay, decided he had to spend some time before he went to Bavaria with Gerhard Hauptmann because he won the Nobel Prize in Literature. And I always thought that was a really interesting story, and I'll explain later on, but I knew about this already in advance. So anyways, so keeping that in mind, so now we're at the end of the war. The war ends, and fortunately, the Americans had basically come from the West, and they had taken over Bavaria, and an American lieutenant actually, let me back up. So actually what happened is Hans Frank got to Bavaria, basically moved in, took all the loot out, and hung the paintings and all that, and then opened up a little Nazi office in downtown. All right, in this little Bavarian village. Here's my little Nazi office, okay? And an American lieutenant basically came one day, literally knocked on the office, he answered, and then he got arrested. And they trucked him off to Nuremberg, he was tried in Nuremberg, and he was hung for war crimes, right? So, good. And so, and they found the Da Vinci, and they found the Rembrandt hanging in the guy's house. But not the Raphael. So everyone wonders, okay, what the hell happened to the Raphael? The last place it was seen was at the Baron's castle. Now, interestingly enough, during the Nuremberg trials, he always claimed he didn't know what happened. No, there was so much going on, yeah, I couldn't keep track, and so he never said. So, what happened? Well, there were three major scenarios that were proffered by folks about what might have happened to the painting. Because remember what I said earlier, it has a value because it is believed it exists, that it wasn't destroyed. Okay? And this is a very important point. So what they believe is that there are three. The first one was that, in fact, this they got from his son. So his son wrote a book, and really scathing his father. Obviously, he was the butcher of Poland. Why wouldn't he? And he basically said that after the war, there was so much hunger because there was just there wasn't, everything had been destroyed, right? And so it wasn't easy to get food, and there were a lot of starving folks. And so he said that his mother took the painting and sold it to a farmer for eggs and bacon. Eier und Schinkenspeck. That's exactly what it says. So that's one scenario, right? The another scenario is, and this was depicted in The Monuments Men, the movie, and that is that it was actually cut up for firewood, that it was in fact found, and it was probably laying around in the Baron's, maybe in the Baron's castle or whatever, and there were, at that time, there were roving groups of refugees, there were roving groups of deserting soldiers, and they were all basically trying to stay warm because it was January, okay? And so the argument was, well, maybe they found it, they didn't know what it was, and they just kind of made a bonfire out of it, right? Because it's a wooden painting. So that's another one. Another scenario was, well, it's here. It's around. It's been floating around through the black market for the last 40, 50, 60 years, and it's hidden somewhere in a Swiss vault. Which is also a weird story because, so I'm doing my research on all this stuff, and I read an article that says, Raphael's portrait of a young man has been found, and it is in a Swiss vault. And I went, oh shit. I have to find another painting. I'm in the middle, okay? I'm in the middle of my book, and oh no, this doesn't work, right? So I start looking around for another painting, but fortunately I read another article about, I don't know, maybe a week or two later, I read another article that was written after that article, and that article said, oh, you know that first article? It was a hoax. And I went, oh, thank God. The painting is still missing, yeah. So that's the third scenario in all of this, okay? So, but we don't know. I'm near the end. So that left me with two giant problems in this book, right? In order to write this book, I had to, if the painting exists in the book, it means I have to come up with a solution for how it was found and what happened to it. Now, you might think, oh yeah, well, so what? Just come up with something creative. It's not that easy. You know why? Because people have been trying to figure this out for the last 80 friggin' years, okay? And I come along and go, I got to come up with something that's better than what they thought of, or it doesn't work. And that's why I told you the little story about what happened to Hans Frank before they retreated to Bavaria. And I kept coming back to that scenario. And I said, what if it's the end of the war, Hitler's in his bunker, Hans Frank figures these paintings are his, he's never going to have to give them back to anybody. What if he wanted to impress Gerhard Hauptmann and give him the painting as a gift? It's January, it's a belated Christmas present. He gets to basically impress a Nobel Prize winner, right? No one had ever come up with that idea, and so I solved my first problem. Okay, this, sorry, I forgot to flip the thing. But now comes the second problem, which was equally as hard. How do I get a painting that was last seen in Poland to Portland, Oregon? Think about this, folks. Portland, Oregon. Not exactly a mecca for Nazi loot, unless you guys know something I don't, right? Not actually even a mecca for art. It's not New York. It's not London. It's not Paris. Not even San Francisco. It's Portland, Oregon. I'm going, oh crap, how do I do this? So I start researching and I start reading about various different things. And I read about a baron who lives in Portland. Just a baron who lives in Portland. So I'm researching this baron that lives in Portland, and I find out that, and one of those Wikipedia pages, at the very, 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 very bottom, there's this little link, and I click on it, and it brings me to a book. And this book is written by, it's a self-published book, and it's written by Helena, who is the adopted mother of this baron in Portland, Oregon, okay? And it's a published book. It's an autobiography, and it's about her life in Germany during the war and after the war. And here's the really cool part. When she got to be 80 years old, she decided to go and come and visit her adopted son, the Baron, and she moved to Wilsonville, Oregon. It was nirvana for me. It was like, holy crap, God is really looking out for me. I couldn't have asked for a better solution. And so that's exactly what happened. So I basically, and all of this you'll see in the book, you'll read this in the book, and it took me. Now, the problem was, okay, I didn't know all that at the time. I just saw the book, and it's written in German. Well, again, remember I told you I was born in Berlin. I don't read German, but guess who does? My mom, who I dedicated the book to. And my mom, okay, who was 89 years old at the time, read this entire book and wrote me a 50-page summary in English, okay, about everything that happened to this countess. And there was this little anecdote inside that 50 pages of translation. There was this little anecdote about how she, right after the war, had traveled across war-torn Germany to find this hunting lodge where part of her families or her extended families had hidden some paintings. Oh my God, really? Had hidden some paintings in this little alcove behind a heavy wine rack, and the Russians, who had already basically vandalized the hunting lodge, didn't find that, and she was able to get the paintings out and take it back to the other estate. Again, are you kidding me? I just dropped this painting right into that lap right there. So that's how I solved that problem. So thanks, Mom. So that's basically the end of that talk, and the only other thing I have is, so when I first wrote the book, at the very beginning, I thought it was just going to be a fun thing to do. It's a bucket list item, right? Like I said, thought about this for 8 years, decided to write it down, and never thought there was going to be a sequel, never thought it was going to be particularly well reviewed, didn't know all of that. Turns out, people liked it. And thank you, it's great. And my publisher said, I need a sequel. And so I had this challenge because I wrote a book about two average entrepreneurs who have wives and children and dogs named Boomer, and they don't even have so much as a traffic ticket for the most part. Well, I don't know. And all of a sudden, it's like I got to come up with a sequel. And I said to my publisher, I said, this is going to be a problem for me. I said, because have you ever noticed that most thrillers have very cliche heroes, right? And in other words, most thrillers always have an ex-cop, a former alcoholic lawyer who is trying to find redemption, ex-CIA guy, retired FBI man, or some guy who was a cop and he somehow did something really bad and they kicked him off the force. And the reason for that is because those are the kind of guys that kind of travel around the periphery and they basically can get into trouble all the time. You can't take two average guys who live average lives and stick them into serious, difficult situations, dangerous situations, serially. It doesn't work, right? I'm not going to have Marty and Bo, fighting mafia henchmen. It doesn't make any sense. So, yeah, okay, I hear you, but I need a sequel. Okay, so a sequel is coming. One of the things that Roy and I, we were very fortunate in that we had a lot of really wonderful experiences, one of them having to do with the Vatican. And so the second book, which is, I'm about 3 months away from getting it to the publisher. It's almost all done. It just needs a kind of a little bit of a rewrite on some things. And it takes place in 5 days in Rome. And it is basically about how our heroes get caught up between the Italian mafia and the Vatican Bank. So I hope you guys will read it when it comes out. So, and that's it. Are there any questions? No questions. Wow, this was really good then. Okay, well, thank you again. Yeah. Yes, a person who I clearly don't know.
Character of the son. Will we get to see any more?
Well,
Yeah.
yeah,
Opportunities.
yeah. So oddly enough, you look a little bit like my son. Very handsome young man, I might add, with a gorgeous girlfriend. No. The entire thing takes place in Rome. No, the entire thing takes place in Rome. But in the third book, the son will play a bigger role. Yes.
Oh, you do have a question.
Does Boomer come as Boomer in book 2?
No, because it takes place in Rome. But he will be in book 3. Yes, book 3 will then be back in Portland, and there'll be I already know what it's got to cover, and yeah, Boomer will be part of that.
But will you,
Oh, I don't know if it's, all right, anyways, just talk loud.
will you, you kind of stole my question when you answered the question about how these two entrepreneurs were going to end up continuing in a crime and thriller genre book. So I'll go to my backup question, which was, how do you, in those 8 years and while you're thinking about, how do you track the ideas that you're thinking about putting in and sort of like make notes or whatever to remember to pull them in later on?
Yeah, I didn't do that. I actually, I don't know, it's maybe just the way my brain works, but I have, it's very easy for me to create a story in my head and retain it. I can't remember my home address. I can't remember people's names. I can't remember many things. But for whatever reason, people have weird things that they can do. For me, I can think of a story and I can actually keep it running in my head. And even if I don't revisit it for, like, let's say 3 months, I can come back and go, what was it? Where did I leave that off? Oh, yeah. And then I can just keep going. I don't know how my brain just works that way. So.
Yeah, I was going to ask you. I think you already answered it. Like, you're a great storyteller. So where do you attribute that from? Is that your mother, or where? I mean, it sales everything. You tell that story.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know. It's no one else in my family does it, but you're right. I do have a habit of telling stories. Yes.
And 30 years later, can you share the birthday story?
The what story?
Birthday story?
What story?
The birthday party story.
The birthday party story. I don't remember that one. I don't remember that one. Oh, yes, it's a totally story. Yeah, we're streaming, so I'm not sure they're going to let me. Bottom line is, just a very quick, I once set my boss on fire at a birthday party. Literally set him on fire. Not kidding. They actually had to go to the hospital. It's a great story. I'm willing to tell it after the streaming. It's book 3.
Yeah, oh, sorry. Yes, you can. Thank you very much, Michael. It sounds like if you want to hear the Hair on Fire story, you have to go back by the book table where he's selling his books and go buy one. And then you can talk to him then. And just a really fast reminder, as you're walking out, grab a cookie. When you're getting your cookie, fill out a survey. And then when you're walking out a little more, don't forget to visit our Friends of the Library table. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Michael. Everyone, a big round of applause. Yes.